Richard Solomon, taking care of business, WCWP 88.1 FM, continuing our coverage on the COVID-19 response. Right now, we're going to be talking to Alex Pabst. Alex Pabst is an attorney specializing in the field of landlord-tenant relationships. His phone number, grab a pen, or at least catch this later on YouTube or some other podcast source, and we'll repeat it there too. 718-841-7103. 718-841-7103. All right, Alex, welcome to our platform here.
Thank you very much for having me, Rich.
All right, so all day long I get phone calls during this pandemic. What's the story with landlord-tenant relationships? What's the story with rent? What's going on in the city? What's going on in the state? But before we do that, can we just get a little 101 on landlord-tenant law and how that works?
Sure. So in general, what happens is parties enter into a lease agreement before they enter into a relationship where someone would come into a premises. Most of the time. Sometimes you have oral lease agreements. Most of the time they're written lease agreements. And those leases set out the defined terms. And if there's a breach of that lease, there's rules and regulations under New York State statutes that allow landlords or tenants, if the breach is the other way, to seek remedies in court. Most of the time, you're seeing non-payment cases where a tenant fails to pay rent, and the landlord serves them a rent demand, and after the rent demand expires and the rent's not paid, then the landlord would bring them into housing court, as we call it. So that's the normal, run-of-the-mill, day-to-day case that we would see. I'd say 75 to 80% of my cases are rent demand, non-payment proceedings.
Okay, now wait. There's residential and commercial. So could you distinguish between the two for our listening audience?
So residential leases are treated a little differently. Commercial leases are between what most of the time courts would consider sophisticated business parties. And the terms of the agreement, no matter how detrimental to one side or the other, will generally be upheld by the court. In residential cases, you have a lot of regulated units, regulated meaning rent stabilized, rent control, or even some form of government funding such as NYCHA or HPD Section 8. Those are much more scrutinized by the court in terms of the language. There are certain things that are allowed to be in there and certain things that are not. So those are the main differences. In the commercial lease, the contract's going to prevail. In the residential lease, it's going to be a lot of statutes and a lot of court-driven law that is going to determine sometimes the rights of the parties. But in the non-payment proceedings, it's pretty simple. If you don't pay the rent and the tenant doesn't have a valid defense for not paying the rent, then generally the tenant has to pay back the rent through some form of agreement or through a trial.
All right. So now that we have this pandemic and an economic shutdown going on, there's a lot of people out there who are being economically distressed, both on the residential side and or the commercial side. Let's talk first about the residential side. How is that working, and what rules are being set forth by either the New York State government up in Albany or the local New York City government down here, or things in Long Island?
So I'm going to combine the two at first because, unfortunately, right now they're both being treated as one. And what what the governor has done, has issued an executive order that has basically stopped the service of a rent demand. So if someone stopped paying their rent, the landlord could not serve a rent demand to bring them into court until, from my interpretation of the executive order, until after August 20th, residential or commercial.
August 20th, 2020.
2020.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, the governor did provide some relief for landlords in the executive order, but only residential landlords. What the governor did was he allowed the tenant to make the election if they want to use their security deposit to pay for some of the rent that they're falling behind. They can, and enter into a written agreement with the landlord allowing them to do that. Certain things would have to apply. The tenant would have to repay the security deposit or get insurance that would cover the landlord for their losses. Now, security deposit is something that you give when you enter into an apartment or a commercial space that basically indemnifies and helps the landlord cover any cost of damages once you leave the premises. Problem is, the governor's executive order didn't do this for commercial leases.
Now, I guess by private agreement, can commercial tenants offer to use their security deposits to pay rent? And if they do, is that actually something that's wise to do, both from the tenant side or the landlord side? Because then the landlord may not have any security left to draw upon.
You can make those agreements. You can always make agreements between the parties, especially in commercial settings, that the courts will uphold. It's much harder to do it in a residential setting. Courts don't like out-of-court agreements that are not between attorneys, and a lot of residential tenants are not represented, at least until they get into court. But commercial tenants and commercial landlords can work out their own arrangement where you can drain some of the security. And I'm assuming in those circumstances you would want the replenishment of the security at some point to protect yourself down the road. There are a lot of commercial leases that you will see that already has that provision in there, where if the tenant falls behind, the landlord can draw upon a security deposit or upon a line of credit that you've provided to secure the premises.
Now, during this pandemic, you must be getting calls left and right from all kinds of people. What are you experiencing? What are you hearing?
I'm hearing a lot of frustration, a lot of concern. I represent a lot of, I'd say 50% of the landlords I represent, at least 50%, are small landlords, people who own a home, who may rent out a legal floor, and they're not just getting the income in that they normally would, and these are not people who own a lot of properties. So they're concerned that they're not going to be able to pay their bills, while some of those bills under New York State rules and the governor's executive order have been stayed, and they can't collect on them, such as utilities and things like that. Like, they can't shut your electricity off if you don't pay it right now, but that's going to come back to bite you in a couple of months when you get a large electric bill. Some of these small landlords are really concerned about how things are going to go, especially with the mortgages too, because right now the mortgage companies can't start foreclosure proceedings if you don't pay, but at the end of the time when that happens, you're going to owe them a few months too, and they can start a foreclosure proceeding. So I'm getting a lot of concern and a lot of frustration on the part of small landlords. For my bigger clients, they also have, people might think of them as, they're rich, they own all this property. Well, they employ a lot of people. Employ a lot of property management, office staff, clerical work, and a lot of the income that they get from the properties goes to pay their workers. And there's a lot of concern that the budgets are going to be getting tighter, and people are concerned for their jobs. And that's a lot of the frustration and just not knowing what's coming that I'm seeing out there.
Now, I guess this is all like a big domino effect or a cascade problem, because tenant doesn't pay landlord. Landlord has to still pay taxes, utilities, insurance, mortgage, accounting, payroll, repairs, maintenance, etc. And then if those people don't get paid, then it just keeps just cascading forward. And one of the things that's sort of good and bad about our economy is how much everything is interwoven. And you don't see that more clearly than in real estate, because if something at the base level of the pyramid isn't functioning, then the whole pyramid can't sustain itself.
Correct, and that's one of the bigger problems, is that this uncertainty, this not knowing of what's going to happen down the road is leaving a lot of people wondering how they're going to pay their bills. And it's on both ends. It's from the tenant's end and it's from the landlord's end. You mentioned the phrase kicking the can down the road, and that's pretty much what we're going to be doing for the next couple of months. I'm not sure if you're aware, but you can't start any new cases of any type in any court in the state of New York right now, except for certain emergency matters that the court has deemed that you have to allow to be started right now. They're not talking about allowing new cases to be started for at least 60 days, from what I'm understanding. That's at a minimum.
And there probably will be an avalanche of cases of all kinds, because the court system generally has a lot of cases that are generated normally, breaches of contract, accidents, defaults, all matrimonial, family. I mean, there's just all kinds of cases out there. And for the courts to be closed for months. You can only imagine. Then you have this economic upheaval on top of it. Now, as I understand it, landlord-tenant court's a very paper-driven court. There's no real electronic filings, as I understand it. How is this going to work in an age of social distancing and clerks' offices that don't want to really touch paper anymore?
It's a question I've been thinking about a lot in the last couple of weeks, and been in some meetings and conferences with other attorneys and the members of the Queens County Landlord-Tenant Bar Association, trying to figure out, how is this actually going to work when we get to go back? And you're right, landlord-tenant is one of the few courts in New York that doesn't allow electronic filing. Now, in the last month and a half, the courts have opened themselves up to virtual conferences for cases that have already been on, and in the process of doing that, they've set up a delivery system for electronic service and delivery of papers in landlord-tenant court, but only for existing cases. There have also been talks for years of e-filing actually making its way to the landlord-tenant court, but we're hearing that that's not actually going to happen anytime soon, because they've been working at getting up the electronic conferences and all the other electronic delivery means. That the e-filing thing is kind of taking a bit of a back seat to everything at this point, which is understandable, but it's also frustrating on our end because you're right, it's all paper-driven.
And it's also in-person driven. I've been to various courthouses where you see the court bring the people up, the parties, the lawyers, depending on the circumstances, and then there's a real discussion. What's going on? What's the default? Why was there a default? Was it a health issue? Was it a business issue? Was it this? Was it that? Can we work something out? And that probably is done better in person than by other means.
It is, and it's so prevalent in landlord-tenant court because when you first go in, if you're going to conference with the other side, either on your own, you two will sit out in the hallway and try to work out a deal, or you go in front of the judge's court attorney and try to conference and settle them out that way. And if the settlement is reached, or if you need to make an application, then you have to go to the judge. So you're seeing all these levels of in-person communication that, in the age that we're coming into, it's going to be very difficult. Courts are talking about a severely limited calendar in landlord-tenant court.
Right now,
generally,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Generally, you're seeing sometimes upwards of 100, 120 cases in some parts. I mean, if I had to guess, it would be difficult to have 20 cases in some parts, at least in the beginning, until they can figure out a way to make this work.
Right. They're going to really need the cooperation of settlement and attorney-to-attorney discussions to really smooth things out. By the way, you're listening to Taking Care of Business. My guest is Alex Pabst, attorney at law, 718-841-7103. And he is a landlord-tenant attorney that I have the utmost respect and admiration for, which is why I asked him to be on this segment of the radio program. In the few minutes that we have left, could you take out your crystal ball and tell me how you see this going down the road? How are you going to talk to clients? How are you going to look at papers? How do you conference complicated things with your clients, with adversaries, with the court? How's this going to really...
The era of virtual conference is upon us, Rich, and then that's kind of the way I'm looking at this, and the cure to the housing court ails, and what's going to really be an issue going forward is how can we continue these virtual conferences, because you don't need to make appearances all the time. In the city, they've implemented programs where a large majority of the people on the tenant side coming into court are going to be represented by attorneys. And they have to figure out a way to streamline that process so the tenants don't have to come into court not knowing if they're going to have an attorney the first time. And they're going to have to streamline it so we don't have to have this many people. If you could come into Queens County Housing Court on any given Wednesday when this program is around, you will see upwards of 100 to 200 people in a courtroom for conferences, because they split conference parts in the Queens Courthouse. So they have to figure out a way to do that, and the best way to do it's going to be virtually. Now, can they carry this going forward? I don't know. I don't know if they're going to want to. They're very hesitant to change things. They have been over the years. It's taken a long time to get, e-filing into normal Supreme Court cases. So, jump-starting this right away in landlord-tenant court with virtual appearances is going to be very difficult for going forward. But I think it's the only way to really deal with just the inundation of cases they're going to be getting when they allow more filings.
So in the last 2 minutes that we have in this segment, how are attorneys going to have the little whisper to the client? Like let's say, the judge is in a virtual conference and they say, well, why don't you settle for X? Well, that's usually where the attorney and the client kind of go on the side and they kind of say, do you want to take it? And they go, yeah, I could do it. And they go, all right, fine. How do you do that now when that's going to not be available?
So under this system implemented by the court, it's Skype for Business, and they don't have what's called breakout rooms, which is something where you can go to the side and talk to your client or somebody else and not have it be part of a larger discussion. It's going to be a lot of texting and a lot of, excuse me, please hold, and I'm going to make a quick phone call and step out of the room in that regard. It's new for everybody, really. I mean, it's not new in the large scheme of things, but in housing court and in the attorney world that I deal with, for the most part, it's new business, and we're all gonna have to figure out a way to make it work so that our clients get the best service, that we help keep the courts as safe as possible for the justice that needs to be rendered. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I'm seeing now, is a lot of frustration of, well, I can't do anything, I can't start a case. Got to keep the court safe and still do it in a way where justice can be rendered in the appropriate manner.
Right. When you think about it, we only have like a minute left, but when you think about it, the court buildings are crowded. Elevators, packed courtrooms, not a lot of places for people to be socially distant. It's going to be a great challenge. Okay, this is Richard Solomon. I have with me Alex Pabst, Pabst, 718-841-7103. He is just a person I have the utmost respect for. And when people call me with landlord-tenant questions, that's the number I speed dial and conference in. Thank
you very much, Rich.
He's been at the forefront of the COVID-19 epidemic with respect to the court system. And we'll certainly make sure that this segment is posted in as many places out there, because I'm sure that a lot of people out there want to hear what we have to say about this topic. And again, I'd like to have you back in the future, a few months from now, we can update this segment.
That's absolutely great, Rich. I do appreciate that.
All right. Stay tuned.